is with design, it's not so much about that thing as it is the journey. Today, the journey's taking me to a company I call Newkind. Some of the folks I used to work with at Red Hat and I started this. I left Red Hat 4 years ago to start Newkind. I know I look old kind, but it's Newkind. And part of it, again, when Michael Porter was talking about competing within an industry, we're within that creative communications, marketing, advertising industry. But we intend to be a disruptive force in that industry because, to be frank with you, there's been so much, I'll say, inauthentic, my NC State roots want me to say bullshit, in marketing and communications over the decades that we think that's wrong. And we think generations like yours aren't going to put up with it anymore. You have the internet now. You're able to link up with your own communities of people that you trust, and you don't have to hear the big bad voice of authority telling you what to think and what to believe. So Newkind is about that. In fact, we call ourselves Community Catalyst. How do we build communities around the products and services of an organization, either internally or externally? And that's what we do. We do that through storytelling and symbols, and knowing and understanding the media, the airwaves that those stories and symbols are delivered, through which they're delivered. We learned a lot of this at Red Hat. How many, and I'm going to ask sometimes how many of you, okay, a show of hands. It's not I actually want to see. So how many of you know of Red Hat? Great, great. Red Hat is probably the world's leading, not probably, the world's leading open source company, certainly Linux, and has proven that you can build a business model by selling people stuff that they have created, all right? So we would work with companies like the New York Stock Exchange or eBay or DreamWorks, Amazon, Federal Express, Chicago Mercantile. They would have more engineers working building our software than we had. They would work with us to build the software, and then we would sell it to them. That's a pretty good business model. What I was responsible for doing there was heading up the brand communications and design team. So we were the folks who created the stories. Because you may not have heard, a lot of you have not heard of Red Hat, and I was delighted that many of you had, but you've heard of the people who wanted Red Hat dead. That included Microsoft, Oracle, some of the most fierce competitors since Genghis Khan. Well, Red Hat's still around. And I say it's because we created great stories. It happened to be true as well. While I was there, I led an internal design thinking a campaign across the company globally. We wrote the very first entry in Wikipedia on design thinking. It's changed a lot. So why are we talking about design today? Well, as I said, I grew up as a graphic designer. And I have a story to tell you about how business has traditionally looked at design. When I was young, not much older than you today, I was working with a small little ad agency, and we did some ads for a local delicatessen. And when the accountant person went in and gave the client the invoice, the client looked at it and said, what's this, design? What's this for? What's this charge for? And the accountant exec said, well, he's, we have to hire a designer. Someone has to design the ad. We have to pay them. And his response was, well, give me a pencil, a ruler, and a cup of coffee, and I'm a designer. So too often, that's how business has seen design. But today, Tom Peters, probably one of the top 5 business gurus of the 20th century, says design is it. And Roger Martin, a name that I hope you're familiar with, says businesses have to imagine, to out-imagine the competition, to think, to become more like designers. This is not my tribe of designers, this is the business world. Magazines from Wall Street Journal to Harvard Business Review to Fast Company are saying things like this: designers are the new driver of American entrepreneurism. Why design? And one thing we learn as designers is not to take the first answer to why, but to ask it about 6 or 7 times. Well, I'm going to say that design today is important because innovation is important. It's important today like it perhaps has never been, and certainly in the last century. And innovation is important. Why? Why innovation? Innovation is important because it drives competitive advantage. So again, Michael Porter talking Tuesday about how you can create a competitive advantage for your organization, your company. Design drives innovation. Innovation is how we're going to compete. The Economist. Innovation is now recognized as the single most important ingredient in any modern economy. John, what do you think? John's on board. What does Michael Porter say? So Michael Porter, he didn't spend much time here, but his 5 forces model, this really changed the world of business over the last 30 years. Companies that understood this, it looks very simple, but companies who really got in and understood this had a great competitive advantage. And I was not at all surprised when he said that from his experience, that perhaps as many as 75% of businesses today don't get it when it comes to strategy. Less get it when it comes to design. So if you're looking for a place to gain a competitive advantage in a new company or an organization, design is a place to look. I'm going to take just a minute to explain this in the way I explain it to people. If I was, let's say, 150 years ago, I was a wagon maker in St. Louis, Missouri. All right, I was making wagons. I had people coming from the east. They wanted to go west. All right? So there would be other people there who made wagons. Right? I had to know what was going on there. I had to figure out how I could compete with them. Right? If they were driving the price down, I had to find another way to compete if I wanted to make money or drop my prices. I had to also be nervous of the guy from St. Louis and St. Joe who decided they wanted to open up another wagon business in St. Louis. Threat of substitutes. If I wasn't paying attention to what the guys in Detroit were doing, I was in real trouble. All right? And of course, the bargaining power of suppliers and buyers. And one of the points that has been important to me over my years of business is understanding that if your buyers are powerful, that means your suppliers are powerful. There's a balance there, right? So if you look at this model of how do you control and make trade-offs between these so that you can drive your profits, these are things you're looking at. But Michael Porter didn't talk back in the early 80s when this was hitting. He wasn't talking about innovation. But things have changed. And a few years ago, in the Harvard Business Review, Michael Porter revisited his 5 forces. And he said this quote, which kind of blew me away. Faced with the pressure to gain market share or enamored with innovation for its own sake, managers can spark new kinds of competition that no incumbent can win. This is his nod to how important innovation is today. And that statement, which is not in the right place now, sorry. Innovation for its own sake. If there's a CFO in a company today who's interested in hearing about we're going to invest in innovation for its own sake, they are few and far between. All right? Michael Porter tells us, though, if we're willing to do that, we can find places where we can win. That says win, by the way. For a tight nerd like myself, that's just going to... How are we doing out there? Recently in Fast Company, designers are merging their ways of thinking with startup culture. The result is greater innovation and astounding VC success rates. Everyone know what VC means? I'm sorry, venture capital. Why design? I'm quoting a lot of business folks here today because, again, in my search as a designer to figure out how to run a business, I've done my own research. Peter Drucker is probably the most famous of the 20th century business gurus. If an organization's structure isn't aligned with its strategy, that organization is doomed to failure. This is a really, really, really important message for us to grasp today. Most businesses are not grasping this, especially in an age where innovation is important. So I'm going to go to Henry Mintzberg. Henry Mintzberg is the professor of management at McGill University in Montreal. And he's given us what he says are 6 valid coordinating mechanisms or structures for businesses. One is direct supervision, typical for entrepreneurial organizations. Now, we can think of entrepreneurs who understand this, right? If any of you saw the movie on Facebook a while back, Zuckerberg, when others were thinking about the idea and kind of using it as a status symbol and playing around with it, and Zuckerberg got it. And man, he went. And he started hiring people. They didn't have to see his vision. He didn't care if they saw his vision or not. He told them what to do, and they went and did it. This is what Mintzberg describes as an entrepreneurial sort of model. And this is a fine model. If you've got an idea out there and you see the whole picture and you can go with it, then this is great. You don't need to make sure the people that you hire see the whole picture. Just tell them what to go do. And it works sometimes. It doesn't scale very well. I assure you, at Facebook now, Zuckerberg is not making every decision. So that leaves, I'm going to talk about 2 other types of organizations. One is standardization of work, right? Typical of machine organizations. So if we think of machine organizations over the past 100 years or more, this was a great way to compete, right? I'm going to become the best machine. And part of it was because there weren't many machines out there, right? Things were by and large done by hand. There weren't restaurants that were machines 100 years ago. Simply weren't. Or 50 years ago, really. All right? But these are machines now. And they learned how to compete, and they did very well with that. So if you want to create a machine organization, you need to understand that that's your structure. But as Porter pointed out, with machine organizations, it's hard to compete. Best practices are easily now followed by other companies. They figure out what you're doing, they do it. Secondly, it's cheap for you to do it in Massachusetts. Move it down to North Carolina, it's even cheaper. Move it to Mexico, it's even cheaper. Move it to China, and it's even cheaper. So if you're going to create a business in the United States today, you've got trouble. You're not going to compete by being the best machine. You're simply not. Doesn't matter how good you get, people can copy it, and they can move it offshore, where it gets cheaper and cheaper. That leaves us with mutual adjustment, or as Mintzberg says, typical for innovative organizations. And what Mintzberg tells us is that for innovative organizations, you want to create a culture. It's not a structure, it's a culture of mutual adjustments. So when we sat down here before class, I saw you coming in, a bunch of human beings, you sat down, you start talking. In fact, the music started playing, you keep talking. It's what humans do. That's how you solve problems, that's how we innovate. That's why spaces like this are important in organizations today. Right? They're open, they change, you can draw. And if I can just share one bit of advice, ignore me, ignore what I ever say, but if you want to innovate, draw. Right? Get something big. Don't be contained by the limitations of an 8.5 by 11 page or your computer screen. Get a big sheet of paper and start drawing. Get a big whiteboard and start drawing. Bring other people in and show them what you're drawing. This is where innovation happens. This isn't a nice to have. This isn't something that we do just because it's cool and groovy. We do this because if we're going to be if our strategy is to innovate, and innovation is strategic, then we have to create a culture where people talk and share and draw in the 21st century. So design is not new. There's a lot of things that we don't know about Neanderthals, all right? We know they're around 20 or 25,000 years ago. They were another species. We know that they were bigger and more powerful, and their brains were far bigger than humans, so they were probably smarter. If they'd had spreadsheets back then, these guys would have kicked our butts. Unfortunately for them, they're not around and we are. What scientists tell us is that they think that Neanderthals, because they were big and strong and powerful, that they didn't leave home very far. They would go maybe 5 miles, 10 miles away, right? A couple hours trip. Humans would go 100, 150 miles away from their home. humans would run away, right? We weren't big. We weren't smart. We weren't powerful. We'd run away. But we found a way to survive, and they did not. I think this tells us a lot about big businesses today and where opportunities are for us who are smaller and less powerful to compete. What we do know is that, well, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. But what this means in today's world is design has traditionally been a competitive strategy for companies that were desperate to compete. All right? So think of if Microsoft owns 96% of the market, as it did on the desktop 8 or 9 years ago, that makes Apple and Red Hat and other companies more desperate to compete in that area. Right? So they do different things that they innovate in ways that Microsoft cannot. While Microsoft's busy killing Netscape, Google happens right under their eyes. Design has traditionally been a strategy for desperate. Now, but it's fundamentally linked to who we are as humans. And I love this quote from William Blake, the Romantic poet. I will not reason and compare, my business is to create. And so I want to all of you here who are in this econ class, to be thinking about how you're going to compete and be human, because we're increasingly being human and not being a machine is a way to compete. Does everyone know where this is from? Right? Cave paintings and let's go. 20,000 years ago, some little hairy human took a torch hundreds of yards deep into caves, started painting. I love Sister Wendy. I don't know if any of you have seen that series on painting, but it's fabulous. And Sister Wendy starts out there and she says, you know, look at this painting of a horse. This is 20,000 years ago, some primitive human. And there's never been a better painting of a horse. All right? There have been great paintings of horses, but none better. She makes a point that that's how art is. While science gets better and better and better, art never gets better than this. We're humans, and it's a great place to find a competitive advantage, being human. This guy, by the way, man or woman, is a designer. All right? This is a designer. We've had some other good designers in our history. Oh, sorry. Right? We took design to a whole immense scale. Architects, illustrators, designers, communicators. Designers created the alphabet. Doesn't matter whether it's in the Western civilization or Eastern civilization. People who started drawing symbols, those became the alphabet, which is the fundamental building block of the civilization. But probably the best example of the modern designer that we have is Leonardo da Vinci. And I mentioned Da Vinci because Da Vinci writes a lot about how to think like a designer, how to be creative and competitive. He's also one who began to really put the human being at the center, right? Thinking about the human experience, thinking about what it meant to be a person as he was solving problems. He's famous for this painting. Now, who can tell me why this painting's so famous? Please.
Always looks like she's looking at you.
It always looks like she's looking at you?
Half the face is supposedly like masculine, slightly.
It's what?
Masculine.
A little bit of a masculine look to her face. What I'm looking for is the smile, right? The smile, the Mona Lisa smile. And the reason the smile is so important is because Da Vinci intended for you not to be able to tell what she's smiling about. Is she smiling because she's happy? Has she got a secret? Is she pissed off? What's the smile? Is it a real smile? It's kind of in between. You can't quite tell. It's a paradox, right? Ambiguous. This was a technique that Da Vinci used quite often. He called it sfumato. Now that literally means to look at through a gray glass, but what it means for Da Vinci is I'm going to create a paradox in my paintings. And this was probably the greatest example. So Da Vinci would tell you this is important if you want to think like a designer. The willingness to embrace ambiguity, paradox, and uncertainty. This is what, if you're a leader and you're creating an organization and you want to be, it's strategic for you to be innovative, for your people to be creative, then it's important for you to create a place where people can live in this paradox. As a designer, if you make decisions too quickly, you lose many opportunities to make better decisions. Roger Martin talks about this, and this is back in 2005, but an article in Harvard Business Review, in which he gave us this chart. I hope you can see it. But he talks about the reliability. Most CFOs and corporate executives are looking for reliable answers. If I'm the CFO of an organization and I'm going to invest $5 million or $10 million into an effort, I got to know that it's going to drive a certain result. What's my ROI? What's my return on investment? And if you can't prove to me that you're going to do it, then I'm not going to put that money in, right? The problem with that is if you have to innovate and you have to know before you get started what you're going to do, well, you're not going to innovate, are you? Innovation, you have to have some place for risk. You have to have some place where I don't know what the answer is going to be if I'm going to get a great answer. So as Roger Martin tells us, these systems and processes on the left, which is so often the language of business, especially over the last 50 years, right? Six Sigma, total quality management, customer relationship management, incentive, shareholder, we're going to maximize shareholder investments. Now, these are old kind of ideas about business. If you're going to be innovative to compete, then you have to build a structure, a company that operates in a way that assures that you're going to be moving towards here. And what Roger Martin tells us is what you're looking for is a robust strategy. You're looking for customer intimacy, not a customer relationship management system. Design excellence is one of those things he talks about. Creativity, jobs that have meaning, corporate social responsibility, and a successful company. These are viable. Viable meaning the best. What's the best thing we can do? Not what's something we can do that we can guarantee we can do. All right? So you have to have a corporate mindset as an executive or as an entrepreneur that I'm going to take a risk. And this one I think is key. And this one we believe at New Kind is extremely important, more important than incentive systems these days. All right? So people are looking to work for jobs that have meaning. All right, back to your history of design class. And I'm going to, all right. This is a painting set at the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh, and if you haven't been there, I suggest you go. Spend some time there. It's it's an incredible asset that we have. The Akron Museum of Art, by the way, has been a client of mine in the past. Is also a great little museum. But I'm going to take you back now to design here. We're going to continue our design history lecture. One thing that artists started doing when they began to realize that they were artists is they began to really try to paint that, whatever it was in front of them, they wanted to paint it just right. They wanted to get it perfect. Right? And we got really good at that. Understanding light, pigments, techniques. They got really good at that. So this is virtually a photograph. And then eventually, a little over 100 years ago, some painters, Cezanne, one of the first, said, you know what? It's not so important that I get that thing exactly right. We've invented photography now, by the way. So I'll just take a photograph if I want that. But what's important is how I see that bowl of fruit. Right? That started a whole new way of thinking. The designer, artist started to interpret what they saw. A few years later, Picasso said, you know what? I don't care what a bunch of naked women look like. This is what I want to paint. This is how I want to look at it. Right? So he really began to abstract that idea and change the role of the subject. A few years later, Jackson Pollock said, I don't need a subject. I ain't going to pretend I have a subject. Okay? I'm in control here. This is about me. Well, I show you this. Well, I'm not quite finished. And then a few years later, Andy Warhol said, you know, I can take a photograph that I didn't take. I can take a soup can, and I can have other people silkscreen it. I don't even have to touch the ink or clean the screen, and I'm an artist. In fact, Andy Warhol is famous for saying, art is what you can get away with. Now, I tell you that because what's happened here, we've seen art go from it's all about the subject to it's about me as the artist to now it's about more than me as the artist. In fact, a few years later, Public Enemy and some other folks said, you know what? I didn't create this, and I didn't create this, and I got this, and I did it with a whole bunch of other people, and we created something that's totally new. Who does it belong to? It doesn't matter who created it. That's why when I went into Red Hat and I started to tell people internally, we're a hip-hop company. That's what we are. Because we're mashing up, we're mixing up what other people are doing and creating new value, something new and wonderful out of it. This is a model, I think, that for the new entrepreneur. That's why I love that you're listening to music. I'd like to be able to pick some of it. But new models of entrepreneurship have to be around collaboration. Again, Zuckerberg works, but it's far riskier, right? In fact, Holden made the point Tuesday. Lennon and McCartney, they both wrote their own work. They didn't really collaborate, but they minimized their risk by putting their businesses together, right? Well, these guys actually put their stuff together. So think about as you're creating an entrepreneurship, new organization, that open collaborative. Your generation gets that in a way that my generation never will. Sharing, value creation through collaborative creation. All right, I'm stepping back, going back into design now. We kind of took a little look at art history, right? Well, I'm going to go back into the 20th century. Does everyone know this? This is a very famous house called Falling Water, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright, I picked him because he's probably the symbol of designer as God. We talked about the artist, where Picasso began to say, I don't really care what I'm painting, or Jackson Pollock. It's all about me. It's about what my vision is. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. Big fan of Jackson Pollock's work. But the idea that designer was doing the same, kind of going through a parallel track here. And this worked. Businesses that understood this in the 20th century also had a competitive advantage. By the way, I like to show you this chair. To show you, this chair was designed about 100 years ago. Right? It still would scare people right now for being so modern and so contemporary. Design has incredible power. Incredible power. This was designed by Henry Dreyfuss, who designed a lot of product in the 20th century, including a John Deere tractor. Lots of things that we take for granted for how important symbols they were. The companies he designed for and the things he designed, the telephone didn't look like this, right? No one had thought about what the television should look like. At the time, it was a box up on the wall. But he designed this. This is how we're going to do it. It's heavy, works. You guys don't even know about doing a, sorry, I'm going to start sounding like an old man. And thankfully for IBM, they had a designer named Paul Rand, who was the Frank Lloyd Wright of graphic design. And Paul Rand designed the IBM logo. He also designed ABC's logo, Westinghouse. These are logos that are still around today. And back to the pencil, the ruler, and a cup of coffee, when he presented this, one of the executives up high level in IBM said, it reminds me of a chain gang. That could have killed this. That could have killed this entire idea, right? Now, does anybody have an idea what this might be worth? I don't have an answer for that, but let's suggest here that another company wants to buy IBM, and they agree to buy all of their assets. They're going to take all their people, all their buildings, all their inventory, everything. And they agree to a figure. They get a number and say, okay, we're buying you. And then at the end, IBM said, great, you got it. Oh, you can't use the logo. You can't use the logo. You think they'd go back and say, oh, we're going to give you less money then? The deal's probably off, right? Because of the brand value, what those stripes mean. That could have been killed in that meeting when that executive said, looks like a chain gang. So as you begin to work, design, you have to learn how to do it. You have to learn how to work, because without a powerful designer, that would have died. Now, we know of design as fashion, right? We understand design as fashion. I was there back in the days when these shoes came out. I'm not sure they really helped you perform a whole lot more than the shoes that Nike was selling the year before. I think they were pretty similar. But it was a symbol of something more, right? This is a great example of two brands coming together and going totally crazy. Michael Jordan and what he meant, and Nike and what they meant. Changed the face of sports forever. I'm showing you these images because I want you to get some idea in the little time I have here today of the power of design. This is design as form, right? This is design that grips you. When you're working with a great designer, the amount of emotion they can get into something. I sometimes used to, when talking to students, would put the swastika up. Because in Mein Kampf, Hitler writes a lot about the power of the flag and design and color and how he would use it to control people. Design is very powerful. This is designed by Milton Glaser, one of the great designers. He's still alive. He also did I Heart New York, if you've seen that. It's the power of design. I dare any of you to forget this image the rest of your life. So a contemporary business person I understand you've read the biography of Stephen Jobs, is that right? You've been assigned it. So one of the things you know then is that Jobs took a calligraphy course in college. It really changed his life. And when he began to work on computers, the type was important. As I mentioned earlier, it makes me crazy right now, but I'll get over it. But type is so important. And design is that important. You know what, I'm going to stay here because I think I have time. 8 years ago, let me have a show of hands. How many of you here today think that Apple as a company will be around in 2 years? Right. Can I see the hands of the people who think that Apple will be out of business in 2 years? All right. So 8 years ago, I was at the Harvard Business School, and they do education programs for professionals, and they had one for designers. It was called Business Perspectives for Designers. And we had about 50 designers go, and these were, mature designers, let's say, the old timers. And we go spend a week and we do sort of a business school program where they give us case studies. And one of the case studies we studied was Apple. Now, let me remind you, we're all designers, so we've been using Apple products for years, right? We were the first people at Apple. We were the ones who, when Apple was getting ready to go out of business several times, we were the ones who kept buying their products and services at a premium, right? So the professor asked us when we started the case study, he said, how many of you think Apple will be around in 10 years, right? So we all raised our hand. Well, he started laughing. And he said, I got to tell you, I ask that question all the time, and I almost never get anybody to raise their hand. And I can't believe, there's no way Apple will be around in 10 years. This has to do with understanding the experience and the power of design. So today the world may see Stephen Jobs like this, but as a designer, I see Stephen Jobs like this. This is Jonathan Ive, Jonathan Ive. I'm sure if you've read the book, you know about Jonathan Ive. Now, Roger Martin says that business people have to become more like designers. But the other thing business people can do is what Steve Jobs did, was become an absolutely tyrant in service to his customers. Not what they wanted, but what they needed, what they didn't even know they wanted. And Steve Jobs played that role wonderfully. And he was able to team up with a designer. And he was brutal with this guy, right? But the designers, good designers, they're not worried about that. They want to do something meaningful. They want to solve a problem. Another little secret is that a lot of business people don't care about solving a problem, right? It's about getting control. It's about building power within an organization, advancing their career. They're not really trying to solve problems. You can't solve problems with people who don't want to solve problems, who don't care about it. Steve Jobs wanted to solve a problem, and he changed the world doing that with the help of a good designer. Which brings me back to this slide again. What this guy say? I'm a designer. Well, you know what? At my age now, I realize he's right. He is a designer. That all of us are designers if we're trying to solve a problem. If we're part of the design process, then we're all designers. And what that means for my advice for you is, if you're thinking about being an entrepreneur or business person, is to do what Steve Jobs did. Take a drawing class or a calligraphy class. Take a sculpture class. Right? Study art history or design. Go to a museum and look and begin to understand the cultural side of things, because you've got to create culture, not just structure, if you're going to innovate. And if you don't understand culture, if you don't understand art and design, you're missing a great competitive opportunity. Steve Jobs got it. Steve Ballmer, not so much. So this is the product, right, that we all see as what led to Apple really taking off. Right? It was doing great work, great machines, great experience, and I knew as a designer, but this is the one that really tapped into the mass appeal. We all doing all right out there? But I want you to think about systems as well, right? Because this is what really took off. It was iTunes. It wasn't the iPod, it was iTunes. Because that system, now, before this came out, before iPod and iTunes came out, I could buy an MP3 player, and I could download MP3s, recordings for free, right? It wasn't legal, but I could do it. But all of a sudden, we decided, you know what? I'd rather use iTunes, pay $1 or 99 cents for my song, and put it on this iPod. So he changed the world. People were willing to pay a premium then to use the system because of the experience. So as you are an executive or starting an organization, you want to think about that experience. That's what Steve Jobs did so well, is just really demand that the experience be exceptional. There are other companies, other great brands that do this. Michael Porter talked about the danger of becoming a commodity. All right? That when you start competing on price, you become a commodity. And we live in a time when everything becomes a commodity, and it becomes a commodity faster and faster and faster than it ever did before. What's more of a commodity than coffee beans? Right? I assure you, when Starbucks started, nobody was going around thinking, gee, I'm going to spend $5 for a cup of coffee. In fact, I was just at Mama Dip's. It cost me $2.95 for a cup of coffee. I was a little bit shocked, to be honest with you. I love Mama Dip's, but $2.95 for that cup of coffee that's a little much. But Starbucks has done a great job of creating an experience around that cup of coffee, right? I can't go to Italy and sit there and have a cup of coffee, but I could go to Starbucks. And you guys may or may not like Starbucks. I prefer a cup of Joe in Raleigh myself, but the idea is that he created an experience. They created an experience which they replicated and which they branded. And if you go to a Starbucks today in Seattle, or one in New York City, or one in Raleigh, North Carolina, or Greenville, South Carolina, you're going to have a very similar experience. You can depend on it. You know you're going to get that cup of coffee. You know you're going to work with somebody who's knowledgeable, who takes care of you. And they listen to you. They think about the community of people around there. They listen. They know what you like, what you care about. That lets them branch into other businesses. They're not just selling coffee beans. They're selling lifestyle. They're selling an intimate relationship with their customers. And it's authentic. We think about companies desperate to compete. So next Friday, a week from now, Black Friday in the United States, 1 out of $7 will be spent where? Walmart. Think about that for a minute. Next Friday, 1 out of every $7 spent in the United States will be spent in a Walmart. Well, if you're Target and you're in that same industry, as Michael Porter explained to us, boy, you got to figure out a way to compete, and it's not going to be price, right? Their systems, everything they do is so good. Their control of their customers and their suppliers is incredible. You're not going to compete against that. So Target has traditionally used design, right? It's a much more pleasant experience when I go into Target. There are people who are actually at the checkout counters, right? It doesn't make my skin crawl to walk through there, right? But I want you to think about design in a little different way. We talked about iTunes as a system. One of the things that Target did is looked at a problem that people didn't know existed. So for a long time now, well more than a century, if you needed some sort of drug, it came in a brown or a blue bottle, maybe it changed into plastic. But we had a problem. We didn't even know it. Nobody even paid attention to it. Because there were people who would get either sicker or die from taking the wrong medication, taking someone else's medication, taking it at the wrong times or in the wrong amounts, right? Prescription drugs. So Target created this system. It was actually a student who created this system that Target saw and said, that's a great system. Looking at the problem that people were dying and getting sick by taking their drugs at home. My parents are aging. I go home now and watch my father try to help my mother take her prescription meds. And he does it every day, and it is an immense battle. And how they get through that, I don't know. Because it's dangerous, and it's scary, and they're old and scared. Target took care of this. You want to know if is it my dad's med or my mom? Is it my dad's high blood pressure or my mom's diabetes medication? Well, they know who it is based on the color. You want to know what it is and how much you're supposed to take? There it is. There's your info. Your info card doesn't get separated. Any of you get your prescriptions filled at Target? I see a few hands. It's really, when you get it and you start using it, it changes your life. It really does, especially if you take a lot of meds. This is the power of design. Thinking of systems, thinking of real problems, solving real problems. It's not just surface, it's not just fashion, it's not just style. Design gives you a competitive advantage. How many of you wear Tom's shoes? So I see a bunch of hands going up. And everybody knows Tom's shoes, right? You buy a pair of Tom's shoes, Tom gives a pair of shoes to some kid in a country who needs shoes, right? That's a great business model. Now, if I'm a cynical business guy, I'd look at that and say, you know what? Those shoes are pretty cheap to make. Maybe it costs him, if he's going to buy 100,000 pairs of shoes, it's going to cost him $1 a pair to make another 100,000. He doubles his order, it doesn't cost him much. He doesn't do any advertising because this works so well, right? If you're cynical. If you're not cynical, you're going, man, he's giving shoes to people who need shoes. If I'm buying those shoes, I'm helping put shoes on somebody. You can say what you want. That happens, right? That's what I mean by, if you're thinking about a business plan, how can you return social good? How can you be investing in something that's authentic and meaning? People want to work for companies like Tom's. And if people want to work there, Let me ask you a question here. How many of you here would take less money to go to work at Apple than you would to go to work with Microsoft or Hewlett Packard? Come on, it's all right. You can admit it. All right. It's a lot of people, right? It's important. They're doing something more meaningful. Tom's can hire people less than, I don't know, name a Nike. I don't know, maybe not Nike. That may be a wrong, whoever, Rockport. And here's the big message. Here's why design is so important, why innovation is so important. We live in an era where everybody is more desperate, right? Competition comes from anywhere. In fact, if you want to be a smart entrepreneur, look at some of these big companies and look at something that they do that they don't do very well and create a company that goes and does that does it cheaper, does it smarter, right? Create Zappos. Amazon's out there. Sears is out there. There was no reason for Zappos. And yet, what does Zappos do? Did a really nice job of picking off some little piece and saying, you know what? You buy it, you don't like it, no problem. You're going to love working with us because you hate working with those other guys. And I don't know how many billions of dollars those guys made, but that's their model. That was their strategy. And how do you do it? All right. How am I on time? All right. Might have some time for me to sing some Johnny Cash to you before we leave. I will. I have no shame. I will sing Johnny Cash. All right. I had mentioned earlier when I went to the Red Hat, one of the things I did, Red Hat was growing really fast. About 500 people when I went to work there. By the time I left 4 years later, it's about 2,500 people. And we needed people who, Red Hat started with folks with purple hair and tats and piercings, and that's who started it, right? It was a to use Henry Mintzberg's model, it was a religious organization really when it started. And it became an entrepreneurial organization, and during that, but an entrepreneurial organization doesn't scale really well because that one guy at the top has to hire and fire and tell everybody what to do. And after about 300 or 400 people, it's hard for that CEO to really understand and see that scale. So it starts to scale. You've got the issues. You got to decide, am I machine org or I'm an innovation company? Right? One of the things we did as we were bringing in all these people is that we had to get a way for them to understand who we were, because if we're bringing in people from Hewlett Packard and Dell and IBM, and they try to change us into Hewlett Packard, Dell, or IBM, then we're dead. We have to be different. Michael Porter tells us we got to be different. We were different. But we also needed them. So one of the things we created was this process, and we called it design thinking. We took it around the globe in the company. We created this way of talking about it, and you're welcome to use this. I kind of took this from what I've been studying all my life. And it starts off it begins with defining your problem. Now, so often in the business world, the CEO or the executives, the managers, directors act as if they are parents. And they just tell you, go clean your room. You don't need to know why I need the room cleaned, right? And that worked for Zuckerberg, right? That works. But if you really want to solve problems, the first thing you got to do is say, guys, what are we trying to solve? What's the problem? Let's define the problem. And let's make sure we get all the relevant data. Let's do our research. Let's share our research, right? Because if I know this, and someone else knows this, and someone else knows this, but we stay in our our little tribes within the company, then we miss opportunity. We bring that data together and share it. In fact, we may have areas where the data is ambiguous or where there's a paradox. Let's live with that and see what happens. That's where opportunity happens. So start by defining the problem and making sure that you have the relevant data and research, and share that data outside of your own group. Get it out of your head, put it up on a whiteboard, and share it with people as they walk by. And then you're ready to ideate. Now there are rules, and if you want to know more about this, you can go on our website at newkind.com or Wikipedia. There are great books. People have different vernacular, different words they use. They talk about the process a little differently, but it's all basically the same. One of the keys to ideation is to suspend judgment, to give yourself a certain amount of time and write down all the ideas you come up with. And one of the rules is there are no devil's advocates allowed, no buts, no selling of an idea. Just throw your idea up there and get as many, because what you want to do is get as many ideas as you can up on the board. Now, set a time limit. Doesn't matter if it's 30 minutes or 2 hours or 2 weeks. Set a time limit. Then you're ready to start prototyping. Choose a few of these and prototype them, test them, put them out in the marketplace. All right? See what happens. See how people interact with it. There's a great video which I thought about trying to show you guys, but you can go on YouTube and find it. It's a company called IDEO. Any of you familiar with a company called IDEO? IDEO? Handful of folks here. They were on a television show called Nightline about 12 years ago. And they spent this show redesigning a shopping cart. I encourage all of you to go look at it. I should have put that on your reading list to look at that video. It's fabulous. It'll explain how this works beautifully. So I encourage you to do it. And part of it is prototyping, taking that shopping cart that they had invented in a week and taking it back into the grocery store and seeing how it worked. So you have to prototype and test. Eventually you choose. This is where the folks who are analytically inclined, folks who like to make decisions and judge things, nothing wrong with that. You got a place to do it, just don't do it too early. Choose. And once you choose, you implement, right? This is where you get into the best practices. This is how we do things. This is how our operations work. The problem, and I think Michael Porter touched on this on Tuesday, is that companies get to thinking that this is what they do. They choose and they implement. They choose and they implement. They choose and they implement. You don't innovate by doing that. You have to do the top part. And finally, the part that they absolutely are scared of doing. Most businesses, most executives and people running most businesses, and that's a big statement for me to say, I have no data to back it up other than my experience. But they don't talk about learning, right? When you set up a process that the last step is learn, it assumes that you're not going to have it perfect. It assumes that you're going to make a mistake. And so many business people with the hubris of executives of believing that anything they say is right is going to be right is probably, in my mind, the biggest danger for both them, their shareholders, their companies, and our society. So they think because they've gotten to a certain area that they are always right. And time again, we find out they're not. But when you start a process in which the last stage is learn, then you acknowledge from the beginning, they're not going to be perfect on this. We're going to learn from this. That's how innovation happens. So this is a great blueprint. Now, one other last thing I'll say here, and this will, again, put on your sfumato caps, because this is not linear either, right? If you sit there and say, we're going to go down this linearly, in a linear fashion, it's not necessary. Because sometimes you'll prototype and you'll realize you're solving the wrong problem, right? It's not that your prototype's bad, you're solving the wrong problem. And you'll go all the way back up to, what's our research say? Let's redefine what problem we're working on. So it's more of a looping sort of process that you go through. But be self-aware, very aware of what process you're in. And the final thing I kind of want to touch on, how am I on time again? Sorry.
4 or 5 minutes.
4 or 5 minutes. Last thing I want to touch on is this flywheel. This is what we use at NewKind. This is how we work with companies. It's kind of how we see innovative companies needing to work. So it starts at the middle. An executive's real function is to setting that strategy and understanding why that company exists. right? And whether that is the mission, or even if it gets into what the strategy is, right? But it's really about understanding its purpose and being able to convince other people that this is a meaningful purpose. The executive's key role is creating a culture, not a structure. But with innovative companies, you create a culture around that meaning, around that purpose. That's the most important thing for the executive to be focusing on. Now, when you create the right culture, as Jobs did at Apple, you focus that on the customer's experience, right? Now, Porter said that you're not out there to delight every customer, but the ones who love you, the ones who are your customers, you want to be very intimate with them. You want to really create a real relationship with them where they love you. And they may be mad at you because you've done something they don't like, but they love you. When you're focused on that experience, making sure that you're delivering the experience to them, when they come together, they will form a community. And that's the key. Forming a community these days. Online allows you to do that so well these days, create a community. You guys know this probably, I guess I said, better than I do. But it's that community, it's that focus on culture, experience, and community that drives innovation. That's where innovation comes from. It's not Frank Lloyd Wright, right? It's not Jackson Pollock. It's not that one. It's not even Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs didn't do that without Jonathan Ives and all his people, right? It's a collaborative that comes through the community, whether that community is internal or external. In fact, some companies like Red Hat, who knows? Does it matter whether you work for Red Hat or you work for the New York Stock Exchange? In a lot of ways it doesn't. That membrane between the two is becoming unclear. But that's where innovation comes from. And in a world where things are driven to be a commodity so fast and so quick and so easy, where brand is so important, the brand comes from your innovation. Steve Bezos says that a brand for a company is like a reputation for an individual. That you get a reputation or a brand by doing good things over and over and over again. That it takes time and there are no shortcuts. That's why marketing doesn't work. It's why advertising doesn't work for branding. All right? Advertising is a medium in which if I'm advertising to you, we have an unwritten contract that I'll bullshit you to get you to buy my product. I may entertain you, I may inform you, there are lots of things I may do, but if you're reading an ad, you know that. This person may tell me something that's not quite true, right? Advertising is the wrong medium. But innovation, experience, those are the right mediums to be delivering. And finally, that gets to the valuation of the organization. And again, whether you're a profit, non-for-profit, traditional capitalist, whether you're a B Corp. Any of you familiar with B Corps? I see one person familiar with B Corps. Wonderful. Doesn't matter. Everybody values your organization in some way, shape, or form. Your valuation being driven through your culture, your experience, your community. And when this starts going like this, as companies like Apple and Starbucks, you attract the right people. You attract people who want to be a part of that culture, right? It starts to spinning, it's a wheel that goes and it starts really kicking ass. This is what you're looking for in an executive or an entrepreneur. At least that's the new kind model.